We all know the dangers. We all know the potential catastrophe. We now have to do something about it.
An understanding of climate change and the science behind it can help open doors. Kids sort of see this as a challenge of the future, and I think it might sort of encourage more kids to get into science, to take on the challenge.
One of the greatest challenges that we face, and our younger generation are going to have to deal with this, finding solutions. I'm an optimist, but I also firmly believe science and technology are at the heart of our solutions.
I'm Julia Knights, Deputy Director of the Science Museum in London, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to tonight's virtual event, the latest edition in the Science Museum Group's Global Climate Talk series. These climate talks ran throughout 2021, the year that the UK hosted the COP26 Climate Summit, and explored topics ranging from the impact of climate change on our oceans to green finance and the future of renewable energy. You can watch those talks featuring internationally renowned speakers, including John Kerry, Jane Goodall, Maggie Aderin-Pocock, and the late James Lovelock, by clicking the link in the description below. So fast forward to 2024, and the increase in extreme weather events globally, including here in the UK, has brought the issue of climate change into even sharper focus. In the wake of the most recent Global Climate Summit, the COP28, which concluded in December, the Science Museum Group is bringing back the climate talks of online discussions to explore issues relating to India's challenge to achieve net zero, while upscaling its industrial activity, the UK's challenge to connect more clean energy projects to its national grid, and tonight, a discussion on the impacts of climate change on global food security. We've assembled a brilliant panel to examine the subject, and I'm delighted to now hand over to our chair for this evening, Tom Heap, the TV, radio journalist and broadcaster, best known for BBC One's Countryfile, BBC Radio 4's Costing the Earth, 39 Ways to Save the Planet, and the climate show on Sky News. Tom, a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, Julia, and thank you very much to all of you for joining us this evening in the latest of the Science Museum Group's Global Climate Talks series. And as you've just heard there from the Science Museum's Deputy Director, Climate Talks is back for the first time since 2021 for a series of 3 online climate debates over the next month with some brilliant speakers from across the globe. And I'm very pleased to be here to chair the first one of this new lot. The focus of tonight's discussion is the complex and fragile relationship between climate and the world's food supply. Our panel will be delving into the science behind feeding a population predicted by the UN to be nearly 10 billion by 2050 without wrecking the planet that is our home. There's increased adverse weather, droughts and flooding due to climate change, which is in turn impacting our crop yields and our livelihoods, particularly for those who rely on agriculture for their income. And tonight I'm going to be speaking with experts whose work, research and insights make them perfectly placed to explain some of the problems and hopefully offer a few solutions too. So without further ado, let's introduce tonight's panel in no particular order. We have Dr. Katherine Nalbe, who joins us from the US, where she is Assistant Professor at the University of Maryland, Africa Director under NASA Harvest and Agriculture. She was also winner of the Africa Food Prize 2020 and the AI Summit Prize in 2022 in recognition of her research in its role in improving food security through remote sensing. That's looking at it from satellites and above. Welcome, Dr. Nakalembe. Thank you. Next, a very good evening to the Right Honourable Lord Deben, formerly chair of the UK's Independent Committee on Climate Change from 2012 to 2023. Lord Deben was also the UK's longest-serving Secretary of State for Environment from 1993 to 1997, the mischief in me makes me want to say that being the longest serving in that post isn't that difficult, given the rotation there. I'm sure he'll forgive me, but he was there for a long time. Presently, he is chairman and founder of Sancroft International, a consultancy that advises business and investors on all areas of sustainable, environmental, social, and corporate governance, also known as ESG, of course. Thank you for joining us, Lord Deben. And finally, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Rattan Lal, Professor of Soil Science at the Ohio State University, winner of the 2020 World Food Prize in recognition of his research on sustainable soil management and its role in improving global food security and mitigating climate change. He was a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Welcome to you, Professor Lal, and welcome to you all. So the way this works is there'll be a little bit of individual discussion before we open up to a slightly broader inclusion, if you like. But first, I want to open the discussion by asking each of you to kind of paint a picture of some of the starkest effects that climate change is having right now on food security across the planet. Just looking for sort of 2 or 3 minutes here, if that's possible. Rattan Lal, would you like to kick us off, please?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'm glad to say a few comments. Food insecure population at the moment stands for about 1 billion, 1/8 people, while the atmospheric concentration of CO2 of 424 parts per million and increasing at 2.2 parts per million per year, which is primarily due to fossil fuel combustion, but also due to land use change. And that raises the question that we got a maximum of 290 gigaton of carbon from fossil fuel that we can afford to emit before the ultimate tipping point when the global warming will exceed what we can tolerate. Therefore, the question that we want to discuss today is how do you meet the food demands of the world? Well, presently, I believe personally that we produce enough food to feed 10 billion people. But we still have 1 billion people not having the food. And that can be addressed by not necessarily producing more, but by reducing waste, which is 30 to 50%, increasing access to food, which is due to poverty, inequality, wars, and political instability. We need to increase distribution. We need to think about our diet, perhaps more plant-based protein than animal-based protein. And we should clearly ban every war anywhere that it happens, because that not only hurts people, but it also hurts the land on which the war happened. And our goal is to have eco-intensification, which means producing more from less. Less land, less water, less fertilizer, less pesticides, less energy, less emission, which means eventually out of 5 billion hectares of land under agriculture now, some of it by 2100 must go back. I hope that what we can return back is barely half of the cropland and more than half of the rangeland and grazing land. Fertilizer that we use 200 million tons now per year should be reduced by improving the efficiency and soil health to more than 50 million tons. And that's the question that I would like to discuss in more detail, because famines and wars are human-made tragedies. We must make famine and mass starvation politically intolerable, morally toxic, ethically unthinkable, humanly unacceptable, while at the same time we restore soil health and promote a greener revolution. Thank you.
Rattan Lal, thank you very much indeed. There's so many notes there already to pick up on, but let's hear a few minutes from Lord Deben now.
Well, for me, the first issue is that this is a universal issue. The point about climate change is that it's affecting every part of the world, and all of us are contributing to it. But the rich countries have in the past contributed much more than anyone else, and the poor countries have benefited from that pollution much less than we in Britain and the rest of Europe and the United States and the other rich nations. So we start off by having to accept that this is a global problem. It has global solutions if it is to have a solution at all. But then the production of food, of course, is absolutely central to the arguments that we have. First of all, because there is no doubt that agriculture is a major pollutant. And as we reduce the use of fossil fuels, and if we win that battle, as I think we will, then agriculture's emissions become the more important as they are much higher up the list. And we then have to recognize that first, that we grow too much because we waste so much. And there I entirely agree. We waste half of what we grow and produce, and we have to stop that. Second thing is we distribute it very badly. So some eat far too much. We have an obesity crisis in the rich countries and among the rich in the poor countries. This is a matter of overindulgence and over provision, whereas so much of the rest of the world has under provision and dies of starvation or malnutrition. And then we have to recognize that as we get more and more of these storms, the problem for farmers becomes greater and greater. Because frankly, if you look at the United Kingdom at the moment, you look at my own small farm, we're an organic farm producer. We use no pesticides, no herbicides, no fertilizer. But we do rely upon some security in the weather. We're lucky we haven't actually been flooded to the degree that our crops aren't growing. But my neighbours further down the valley are flooded and their crops aren't growing. We are having floods in the United Kingdom in places where we've never had them before, including the village next door to which I live. Never had floods of that kind ever before. That's why, for me, I want governments to wake up to the fact that they are only, as somebody once said, 5 meals from revolution. The fact of the matter is that every government has to recognize that if it can't feed its people, it won't be there, because people will not put up with that. And it's particularly true in the rich countries because we aren't used to famine. We're not used not to being able to get the food we want. And that's why it annoys me to such a degree that I am permanently angry that we have a government here and we have governments throughout the rich countries that don't realize the urgency, not just for their nations and for the world, but for themselves. Because if they get this wrong, they won't be there.
Lord Deben, thank you very much indeed. Katherine Nakalembe, please.
Thanks for having me this evening. And I mean, there's so much to kind of pick up on what has already been said, but maybe I'll just add a bit of a dimension from my own perspective. Clear things, adding to the statistics that Dr. Lal presented before. Last year, at the end of 2022, over 258 million people experience acute hunger. As Dr. Lal said, this is, an injustice. It's something that we should not accept and should not continue. And the 258 million out of the almost a billion who experience food insecurity over the world, the 258 million come from about 58 countries. We see also that food insecurity is not only about availability, but largely about access and distribution. So we are producing enough, but it's just not in the places where it's needed. Another thing to add is that, a lot of people might assume that this is, a low-income country problem, but there is food insecurity in developed countries, including the United States and the UK, where people are worried about where their next meal is. If 1, 2, 3 meals out is not a great space to be, especially if you have a family. So it is everywhere, and we should care. And in addition to, the fact that we don't have equal productivity across the world and the disproportionate burden on low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa have the most extreme numbers of people who are experiencing food insecurity. we have extreme events basically cascading and leading into more food insecurity. And you have one event after another that are massive, impacting multiple countries at a time. Sometimes events that seem unrelated are directly related. An example of having a landslide that's followed by a drought, as an example. This happened in 2019 in Eastern Africa. These events continue to happen. In some cases, the same communities that don't have time to recover. With climate change, an example of Cyclone Freddy that happened in Madagascar, this is after Cyclone Kenneth and after Cyclone Idai. Cyclone Freddy was an extreme event that lasted over a month. This is something that was unprecedented, that no country would have prepared for an event like that. And the scale is so massive. If you could just see how massive Cyclone Idai was, that followed by another event a year later is just too extreme for any country to recover from. And in other cases or other instances, and in this particular instance, you have communities that are already at risk, already experiencing extreme food insecurity, and do not have the safety net that exists in many other countries, for example, in the US, that market prices can be maintained and people will be able to put food on their plate.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and to all of you. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time with each one of you before we have more of a group discussion. And I'm going to start off with Lord Deben, just as a little bit of biography, if you like, John Gummer, your your non-title name. What was it that first got you into the environment? I mean, you're an environment secretary in the 90s. What was it that made you realise environment, particularly climate change, really mattered, perhaps a little bit before a lot of other people did?
Oh, well, two books. I mean, first of all, when I was an undergraduate, I read Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring, and convinced by it. And then much later on, I began to understand the climate issue and read quite a number of things, but particularly I read the works of the founder of the organic movement in Britain. And she was Eve Bulfer. She was a remarkably mad woman, but she was a wonderful teacher of treating the soil properly, respecting the soil. And of course, I was brought up in a family which had a very strong view of our duty as stewards. That's what we are. We have not created this world, we have received it, and we have to look after it. And I've always believed that. And so it was natural to get into the environment.
Well, we'll come on, I'm sure, particularly with that respect for soil and the importance of soil in the group discussion between yourself and Professor Lal. You are chair of this Climate Change Committee, which is the organisation that both recommends policy and holds the government a bit to account on its successes or perhaps more recently rather failures on that score. How important a role did food play in the Climate Change Committee's considerations? Is it in the too difficult box sometimes?
No, I don't think so. It wasn't. It didn't start there. I mean, what started was that we recognised that you had to start to decarbonise the generating system. That was really the first priority. Once we got that underway, then a whole range of other things came into the scene. And the particular thing about food was, of course, exacerbated when one began to see what the scientists had told us would happen, which was this increase in storms. And once you get that, then any of us who come from an agricultural background, I was Minister of Agriculture for Deputy and Minister for 7 years. I know perfectly well what this means to farmers. The weather is a really important part which distinguishes farming from any other activity. And therefore, when you have weather which is disruptive, I don't really believe in the phrase climate change. It seems to me climate disruption is a much better way of thinking of it. And that's exactly why food became very much more important.
Now, you mentioned in your introductory remarks that there are some, you think we will win the battle with fossil fuels. And I'm guessing this is because there are technological solutions that are now delivering very well, frequently better than their fossil competitors. Is part of the problem with food and farming is that it's much more complex than that. We don't have off-the-shelf solutions in anything like the same way.
Well, that's absolutely true. And indeed, there are lots of things we don't know about. We don't know what happens if you do certain things. We have to do an awful lot more scientific investigation. And I'm afraid farming has been put on the back burner really for many years. I remember being told by Peter Jay, who was called the cleverest man in Europe, being told as Minister of Agriculture we didn't need a Minister of Agriculture because we could always buy food somewhere else in the world. I mean, they didn't believe in the food security issue. And it's only now that people are beginning to understand that. We took money away from all the advisory systems for farmers. We left farmers on their own. And this is not only true in Britain, it's true throughout Europe.
Yeah. Now, we've talked a bit about the impact of climate change on farming. It was interesting. The Science Museum Group carried out a survey in 2021 about the public's awareness of the contribution of food and farming to climate change, and the fact that there was a strong link there was rather poorly known. I mean, could you just give us some headline hits as to why agriculture, land use change has a huge climate impact?
Well, a lot of people in Britain don't know that milk comes from cows. I mean, let's realise the division of the urban population from the rural population is enormous, so that you have to start off by explaining some very basic issues which people really don't understand. When we take schools round our farms, I have to say to you, the teachers don't know that cows give milk. It is an amazing ignorance which we have. And it's worse in Britain than most other countries because we have been an industrialized nation for so long. So you've got to break through a huge amount of ignorance. It's the parallel with the Americans, where half the population don't believe in evolution. Jolly difficult to get them to understand climate change. And the same is true here. We really do have to get people to understand a bit about farming.
But once they have, I mean, those headlines are just really in headline terms. What are the big contributors to climate change when it comes to farming?
Well, first of all, that the way we farm means that our land has ceased to be something that takes the carbon in and sequestrates it. It's become something that pushes carbon out.
Hmm.
Secondly, the use of fertilizers means that we actually are constantly putting into the atmosphere emissions which we shouldn't be doing. Thirdly, because we use so much pesticides and herbicides, what we are doing is killing the very insects which actually we need not only for actually pollinating, but also it's the balance which they provide to get rid of the other insects which do damage to our crops. We have destroyed the proper circle of life.
You got all through all that without mentioning emissions from cows, which is, of course, one of the more controversial. We'll have a chat about that later. I have no doubt. I'm going to move on
I
to
just say
get some great.
I feel very sorry about the cows. We always complain about their emissions without admitting that we're emitting as well. Emissions
Well,
and are you can't divide them.
I think the biomass of cows is greater than that of humans by some degree. I can't quite remember what it is, but I think anyway. We're both guilty when it comes to emitting. But as far as I know, we're only monogastric, and they have four stomachs, and that often makes the problem worse. Anyway, right, I want to move on to Catherine. Thank you, Lord Dean. We'll be back. Catherine, once again, good evening. I talked about being Africa director for NASA Harvest. I'd like to know a little more about that, please.
Thank you. So the NASA Harvest program started around 2017, and prior to that, obviously there was a lot of work, and there's still a lot of work going in the space of agriculture monitoring with satellite Earth observations. The sort of the seed towards making this possible or happen is the fact that there had been a lot of investment in satellites all over the world. So the European Space Agency has a couple of satellites that are orbiting Earth. There are lots of private, there are lots of NASA satellites that have been put in space to support multiple things, including communications, just monitoring disasters, looking at water, oceans, among other things. And there's been extensive research that is meant to support us to better understand how our agriculture system is doing on the ground. And, we're trying to use the vantage point of space. So Harvest came about as to just beyond the satellite, the data, its existence, and the research going into utilizing this data, how do we move the needle to bring these data to be more useful in a decision-making context? So, saying that satellites can help is that we can monitor, we can track the examples of the events that I showed before, including IDI. You could monitor not only forecast when a cyclone would hit a specific region, but also you can predict the extent of the severity of the event. You can predict and estimate the area that will be impacted, which in many cases could be, the difference between losing hundreds of thousands of lives or saving all of them. So you could move people earlier if you use that technology efficiently. And so the idea is that we want to get that technology and put it in the hands of decision makers to get it out of research to make it possible and accessible. Yeah.
So to pick up on John's remarks about farming being one of the few professions which is uniquely exposed to the weather, with the kind of data and information that you're providing, it makes them more resilient. They can't change it, or only at the very margins can we change the weather. But if you know about it coming, you can do quite a lot about it. Is that the point?
You could do a lot. You could definitely do a lot about it. You can, predict what might happen in the next few weeks to months, which gives you an idea of what the shortfall in production will be if it's an extreme event like IDI, how much cropland will be wiped out, how much you need to figure out where are you going to get the food that will help, the population that's impacted. The other, obviously, is moving out of harm's way. But then there are other things, which is being able to quantify and measure these things continuously. Same way we know that CO2 is what is warming our planet, is the same way that we know because we have measurement of this and we keep track of it over time. We can see increasing severity of events, which when we know this, we can better predict what might unfold, as well as design policies that are proportionate or can be the right magnitude in terms of response. So if you're preparing for a level 2 cyclone, and get a level 10, if that even exists, you're underprepared. And so the idea of prediction and estimation allows you to be able to do that.
Now, I've seen the two letters AI attached to this. Well, what difference is AI making? I sometimes have a little bit of skepticism that it's used as a sales tool, but that's probably just being too cheeky. What is artificial intelligence doing for this world?
So in terms of agriculture and in terms of data analysis, so there are other things, including, trying to improve seeds and come up with better varieties of things that could be more resistant. In terms of what we do, though, satellite data are massive data. So we have hundreds and thousands, billions of pixels. We're looking at the whole world at some time. And the other component is we're looking at multiple data sets. So imagine trying to understand small shifts in temperature, rainfall, soil moisture, vegetation condition, inputs into a particular field. In order for you to build a model to predict really well what the outcome might be at the end of the season, you need to be able to train a model to predict across these different variables. So we can't do that. You can't do that from a human perspective. It is not possible to do it for a small region. If you're using AI and the power of compute, you can process it for an entire country within a couple of minutes, and you can have a good indicator of the the probability of an event as well as the severity of its extent.
Just one thing, just briefly, but before we end this section. Does your remote sensing allow you to see emissions from agriculture? Can you see nitrous oxide from a field that's where fertilizer, for instance, has been intensively used and a lot of it's going up in the atmosphere? Or could you even see a plume of CO2 above a big shed of cattle?
So there is some research and satellites that are being designed specifically for pollution tracking, including looking over cities to just look at the amount of CO2 or particulate matter that might be over a particular area. And there's definitely research that's trying to link what is happening on the ground with what's happening in the lower atmosphere, among other things, and definitely potentially a lot of potential in us for us to be able to measure that level of detail. One thing that is kind of interesting in terms of tracking is being able to track the source of a particular plume, as an example. So you might find that a particular city in India is experiencing pollution, but it's not the source of it. So there's satellites that are being designed specifically to attribute what the point source of a particular pollution is coming from.
And pollution can actually sometimes move from the country to the city. It isn't always the other way around, is it? Thank you very much indeed, Katherine. We'll be back to you very, very shortly. So, Professor Rattan Lal, I'm going to ask what is probably an irritatingly dumb question to you. Why is soil so important in the fight against climate change?
Oh, that's not dumb. That's a very important question. All terrestrial life depends on soil. That's so important. There is no life without soil. And you can also say there is no soil without life. They have evolved together. Soil is the source of most essential ecosystem services, their provisioning. Food quality and quantity, water quality, renewability. We have heard today quite a lot. Soil emits gases and remote sensing can check them. Soil also absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. In fact, I'll give some more statistics on that. If we did manage properly all our degraded soil, we could probably draw down from the atmosphere between now and 2100 almost 160, 150 parts per million of CO2. And if we could find an alternative.
That's a great statistic, and I just want to be understood that I've understood it and the audience has understood it correctly. So if we manage soils correctly, is that what you said? In a way that presumably doesn't undermine our food production.
Correctly. If we manage soil correctly, then it can become a sink of atmospheric carbon dioxide rather than the source. And that's the difference.
I think you said 100 plus parts per million.
It is as much as 150 parts per million between now and 2100.
Wow.
Not tomorrow morning.
It's a massive underused tool for us.
Exactly. This is a big tool. So rather than complaining about agriculture as a problem, those of us who like to eat food 3 times a day have a responsibility to make it a part of the solution. And that's the approach we have to take.
And are you encouraged by, at least in the global north, and I think a bit globally, people have refound respect for the soil? There's certainly very much talk about it everywhere I go now. Soil conferences who used to get, fewer than 10 people, 10 or 20 years ago, are now packed. Regenerative agriculture, all these things, they're all based on respect for soil. Do you think it's real? Is it going far enough? How much encouragement does that give you?
It's certainly very encouraging. For instance, since COP21 in Paris, where the program launched was 4 per mil, 4 per thousand. And the suggestion was put carbon in soils of the world at the rate of 0.4% per year. And that recommendation came from COP21. Since then, all COP, including COP26 in UK, last COP, COP28 in Dubai, had a word soil health specifically mentioned into it. That's the first time it ever happened. So I think things are really getting better. What I would like to see, though, and it has not yet happened, Soil Health Act. At a provincial level, at a national level, at international level. What I mean by soil health, let's take EPA, for example. We have a Clean Air Act.
Protection Agency in America. Yep.
Clean Water Act. How can you ever have clean air and clean water if you have no healthy soil? It's very important to have a Healthy Soil Act. And Healthy Soil Act should reward farmers for making soil as a sink of atmospheric gases. And my suggestion for that is $50 per credit. So if you pay for
$50 per ton,
one credit is 1 metric ton of CO2. Yes, correct. And that way we could demand in a way that if you did, as land manager, make soil a sink, It is possible that you may lose some productivity, but we, the consumer, are willing to pay you the price.
I know. Well, I'll definitely put that to the idea of a soil act to our politician or former politician in our midst to see if he thinks it would fly in a moment. Just before I let you go, though, Professor Lal, on this stint, have you got some examples from across the world of where farming communities are really getting this right? Do you think, looking after soil health, them being carbon sinks, and retaining a decent level of yield?
I think there are examples of good farmers everywhere. Conservation agriculture, regenerative agriculture, agroecology. These words have become very common, very popular. Conservation agriculture, for example, who is counting it has either 3 pillars or 5 pillars, is now being adopted on about 200 million hectares globally, out of a total cropland area of 1,500 million hectares. So that's about 12-13%, but that's a good start. So if we compensate farmers that if you switch, that means you're going to make carbon going into the soil rather than out of the soil in the atmosphere. Society will compensate you in case you suffer some more losses, which might. I think that is one very good example. The second, we were talking about few minutes ago, whether we can see greenhouse gases coming out of the soil by remote sensing. We do have a remote sensor now which can tell us how much was the carbon last year in the soil and what's the carbon this year because we changed from one land. So we do have those options available, remote sensing as well as handheld devices, so we can assess how much carbon credit in soil are happening. So there are tremendous, in a way, improvement. The problem I notice is translating science into action. And although it's a political year in the United States, I have so far not heard any politician, we will make agriculture a solution. I hope somebody will say that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Lal. Now, the time when you're all in this together, I will probably put questions to each of you, but if you want to come in, obviously, more of a group discussion. Let's just pick up this idea of a soil act. We had a climate act here in the UK. Do you think a soil act would be a good idea, John?
Well, the government has promised us a land use policy, and if you have a land use policy, you have to talk about soil. I agree with Professor that we should have a soil act, but I think it's probably best part of a wider act which covers land use as well, so that you would actually be talking about the value and worth of the soil in the context of the way in which we use land. That's why I want to change our systems, that we have a Department of Land Use, and you would then put agriculture and planning actually in the same department, so that you would begin to be able to think seriously about this very scarce commodity called land. I would actually put our marine in that as well, because one of the issues too is getting the seas to take in the soil, to take in the emissions which they once did. And we have to think of the seas in terms of agriculture too, because fisheries and overfishing is a terrible part of what is happening. And if you take bottom trawling, for example, that is actually destroying the ability of the seas to take in carbon, and indeed is making the sea themselves become something which is a carbon exhaler.
Okay, I want to have put a few stones in our shoes, if you see what I mean. Let's start with one of the big ones when it comes to agriculture and food. It's very, very cultural, perhaps even more than other aspects of our fight against climate change. How we farm and how we eat is deeply embedded. And whilst you say, Professor Lal, that it has been part of the United Nations COP procedure, I think they've slightly dodged agriculture and food because they think it's toxic and difficult. So I'll put this to Katherine first. Do you think that there is a unique problem, or not unique, a particular problem with food and farming, that it is so bound in to how we are, how we perceive ourselves, that change is particularly difficult in this sector?
I don't think this is true. I think there is, humans have the potential to adapt and change their behavior. But I think in many cases we need to be encouraged, and there are different ways to be encouraged to do the right thing. And a lot of things could be done, through policies that, targeting specific things. As Dr. Lal was talking about the, Healthy Soil Act as a way of incentivizing farmers to, rapidly adopt more sustainable practices in terms of how they use the land. So in terms of what we eat, while we might be inclined to stick with what we've known all our lives, many people are able to change when it matters the most. So if you had a serious health condition that meant that you were not supposed to consume salt, and that is, it's a life and death situation, you would give up salt, same way you'd give up meat, same way you'd give up other things. And so I think if there is a clear incentive and us being clear about what the consequences of our actions and choices are, we could do a lot better, and policies could help us get to that point. Same with increasing tax on things that are clearly destructive, could nudge us to do the right thing in our agriculture system as well. And incentivize it, make it attractive for sustainable practices that might not appear as if they're attractive. For example, using cover cropping as an option. If those things are clearly incentivized, you pay for the service because we're trying to protect a broader ecosystem and not just your individual.
I take your point that farmers are easier to lead with incentives, and that is indeed happening, certainly in the UK and parts of Europe. But certainly when it comes to food demand, I mean, John Gummer, when this government, and they're not unique in this, are pretty much allergic to any talk about diet, any talk about less meat. I've kind of raised this in interviews on the back of other things, and I've had politicians do this kind of thing, in front of me, as if they're going to spontaneously combust if they say anything about food.
Well, it's very silly of them, because after all, when you think about it, the diet that we have today is utterly different from the diet that we had in 1945 or indeed in 1939, leave alone the war. The fact is, people ate an occasional chicken. They now eat chickens as a constant food. The fact is that people ate entirely differently. There is no reason at all why we can't change that. People's mechanisms change. And when I talk about less meat, I say we should be eating 20 to 30% less meat. Actually, that is happening. People are moving in that direction without any help from the government, just as the government is so hung up about, and not just this government, you're quite right, governments all across Europe, hung up about the fear of being a nanny state. What I want them to do is to give people information which enable people to make proper choices. I happen to be a believer in the free enterprise system, but the free enterprise system only works if you have knowledge to be able to make choices. And that's what we have to do. We have to encourage people to do the right thing. It should be cheaper to be good and more expensive to be bad. It doesn't make you more moral, but it does make you do the right things. And I believe we can do all that. It just is we've got a hang up about the way that people will be prepared as long as you don't lecture them. Now, I believe that we have to have animals as part of the mixture. When you have mixed farming, it's important for the soil. They have to walk on the soil, they have to shit on the soil. All that is very necessary, but you don't need as many. And if we were better about, for example, animal feeding and animal welfare and the medicine for animals. I mean, if we got rid of some of the endemic animal diseases, we would need fewer animals to produce the same amount of milk and the same amount of meat. So there's so many things we can do.
Right. I want to move on to another tricky one with you, Professor Lal. It's often said that artificial fertilizers are keeping half of the world alive today. Half of the human population, as in, because we would be producing half as much if we didn't have them. But at the same time, it's also said that this is not a long-term solution. It's also killing us in the long term, sustaining us in the short term. Firstly, do you recognise that? And secondly, do you think we can get to a way where we're still producing a lot of this food without relying on those chemical fertilizers?
That's a very good question indeed. If somebody asks a question, why has green revolution bypassed sub-Saharan Africa? Crop yield, I was working there in the 70s, Cereal yield was 1 ton per hectare. Now in some places gone up really 50% more. It should be 5-6 tons per hectare, because the soil health in Africa has been ignored. And we have been mining nutrients at the rate of about 40 to 50 kilogram of NPK for decades, since 50s and 60s. But on the other hand, take the case of China using 400 kilogram per hectare, Punjab in India using 250 kilogram per hectare. That's far too much. Africa is using 20 kilogram per hectare. Really, the answer is somewhere in between. Science-based use of fertilizer. Fertilizer has to be used like a medicine. And the difference between poison and medicine is the dose and the time of application and the method of application. That's really the important part. 200 million tons of fertilizer global use is a poison. If we do manage soil health properly, use proper rate soil test, we should not have to use more than 50 million tons, 1/4 of what we are needing. So the idea is producing more from less. Pesticides, the same thing. When soils are healthy, they have high microbial activity, biodiversity, they become disease suppressive soil. You don't need pesticide for a healthy soil. Like human, when they are healthy, they do not need too much medicine. I think the same kind of thing. I think one part which really need to be addressed about the food system is different than the agriculture. Agriculture, the first step. Food system is everything else from transport of food, processing, packaging, cooking, eating, disposing the waste. The food systems of the world right now emit 1/3 of all greenhouse gases, 35%. Agriculture is 12%. So food systems are in need of transformation. And I'm absolutely right that diet is very important factor. So
And just help us
switching
out. Sorry, Professor Lal, what is making up the other 18% there? So you said the food overall 30, I think you said, 12
the
from actual agriculture.
food
What's making up the
transport,
other 18?
food processing, food storage, food packaging, food cooking, disposing the food waste, which is, as has been mentioned already, probably 1/3 of all food produced is waste. All of that add up to a humongous cost. So the food system need a transformation, and diet is very important part of it. I don't think anybody is talking about no meat. I think we are talking about diet which is not only healthy for people, it's also healthy for the planet. And somewhere that education is not being communicated. And I think it should be a part of education right from primary school onward. What's a healthy diet? What's a healthy food? What's a One Health concept? How is soil health related to human health? I think all those are part of how diet causes obesity in one case, but if it is eaten properly, it's healthy for the planet as well. I think those are some very important consideration. I think one part which really need to be said about Soil Health Act, and when I said we have tremendous potential, we have 30% of all Earth's land degraded by erosion, by salinization, by nutrient depletion, such as in Africa, by depletion of organic matter content. Restoring those degraded soils has a tremendous potential by afforestation, by returning land back to nature, by cutting down the too many livestock, as was mentioned before. And they
Sorry to
grow
interrupt you, Professor Lal. Just on that restoration, because I think it's a really important point, especially, and I'm sure Catherine will know about this, across areas of sub-Saharan Africa, but not just there. Degraded soil happens in the north as well. Is it the restoration of that soil? Can it be done relatively quickly?
It's a slow process.
Oh,
I have to admit that. It is on a decadal scale, maybe generational scale. You cannot overnight, you can degrade a soil overnight by mismanagement, but you cannot restore quickly. It's a slow process. That's why I mentioned between 2020 and 2100, we have a potential to restore all those degraded land and put carbon back in trees and soil. And to do that, though, I think it will be incomplete. When I said let's pay farmer $50 per credit, I didn't say where that money will come from. We have 600 million farmers, out of which 500 million farmers are small farmers, less than 2 hectares in Africa, Asia, elsewhere. If everybody gets 2 credit, let's say per acre, by better farming, and we pay them $100 per acre per year, or a person with 2 acre get $200, 500 million farmer will get $100 billion. So you are talking about paying farmer something like $100 billion per year. Where will that money come from? Will it be carbon credit, demand and supply? I'm not sure, at least in the beginning. I think we have to go back to the countries which were responsible for emission. Now say, hey, this is a time to return some back. For example, I
Well, I'm
was
not sure how
very,
well that'll go down in the politics of those countries. I'm not saying you're
I know,
wrong, but is it politically sellable?
that's exactly what I'm going to mention. For example, at COP28 in UAE, United Arab Emirates, it was very kind of them to say, we will contribute $200 million. Wow, it's a drop in a bucket. Countries like that and countries like Saudi Arabia and others should come back say, we will contribute 10% of the total.
Okay. I want to come on to a bigger question about food and money, and that is, can we solve this problem whilst we insist, at least in the global north, that food is cheap? Can we solve the waste problem while we insist that food is cheap? And also, can we basically make sure food is doing all these things for the climate? And I know it's not the subject of this meeting, but a lot of people will be saying, and nature too. Can we get it to do those things while we insist that food takes a smaller and smaller proportion of our income? John?
No, we can't. I
But
don't think
no
there's any
politician will ever say that when they're in government.
Well, I don't know. I think I did, as a matter of fact, as Minister of Agriculture. I've always said
I'll go back
that
and check.
if you look at the proportion of the budget of the average family, it has dropped and dropped and dropped. And once you get down to this level, then any rise in it is absolutely unacceptable politically, unless you really start, you have to link all these things together. And one of the things that we have to do is to enable, is to reorganize the food industry. And I think Professor Lau is absolutely right. The problem is not the agriculture, it's the food industry, which creates the circumstance in which we expect, first, to get food very quickly, secondly, to have food at any time of the year, whatever you want at any time, thirdly, not to pay for it a price which is a reasonable price for the production of it. Now, if you've got those three things, I'm afraid you have to confront them. And government may not like it, but you're going to have to do it, and governments are going to have to face it.
Katherine, where do you see the price of food, the cost of food in this argument? Because it's a very tricky one, especially in climate justice, social justice world, isn't it?
Absolutely. And you know, an interesting thing to think about, I think there's a paper that came out, must be last year or pretty recent, which was talking about like the true cost of food. You know, when you go to the supermarket or the grocery store and you really want something, you can get it depending on your income level, but it doesn't actually factor in the actual true cost. There are other things, you know, within the supply chain that, you know, perpetuate injustices. So if you think about things like coffee or avocado, these things that are transported over many, many miles for us to have in the US, you know, avocados are a pretty hyped thing. But if you think about where the avocados come from and they're being transported and how much we end up paying for them, if you think about what the farmer who grew this avocado actually got paid, you know, it's incredibly unjust. And the other thing too is, you know, on the other side of it is, while in the north the cost or the proportion of our income that goes to food is pretty low compared to other places where it could be 80% of a household income, and they can't manage any of the other family expenses, healthcare. You know, sometimes you have to choose between going to see a doctor or feeding the family. So this makes it, an incredibly complicated
Sure.
issue.
But I just think this is something we should be grasping, and it comes into the waste story as well. I am unconvinced that we will solve the food waste problem while we insist that it is, well, in political terms, affordable is the phrase they like, but in effect cheap. Because we don't waste gold, but we do waste food, and as you will know, in the richer world, a lot of the food waste tends to be in our own homes. In the poorer world, a lot of the food waste tends to be on its journey to our own homes. But just sticking with our homes, Catherine, is this something that we really need to get to grips with and say, look, and sort of almost be honest, say, look, it's going to be very difficult to solve this waste problem, as I say, while we insist food is cheap. It seems that way to me, but what do you think?
I think it's something we have to do, and it's something that could also be encouraged. Food should cost its true cost in some sense. There's an interesting article from 2013 which was talking about differences in consumption, and I like this quote. It goes something like like a footprint analysis that in North America and Europe, the amount of energy, land, and materials consumed, it's as if America and Europe, it's as if we were on 4 Earths. Like we have 4 additional other planets, in order for it to be sustainable. And as consumption goes up and increases in these countries, it is just unsustainable. And I think another dimension to this is that it's very easy to just focus within your own local community or within your own county or state or country without looking outside. And that perspective, it's very difficult from that point of view to understand, what you might be doing might be leading to, much broader injustices, to things that will cascade into long-term impacts that will come back and haunt you, similar to CO2 emissions. You drive your SUV every day when you could choose to take the train, but because it's convenient to you in that moment, but down the line it will come back, which is what is happening now. And more people are aware that climate change is not something off in the in the distance, or happens in some places and not others.
Well, let's just come to a few sort of science questions, because this is, after all, the Science Museum Group's climate talks. And I'm intrigued about a number of these things. I mean, I don't want to go back to cows too much, but I know in my own research there are some things which are reducing the methane emissions from cows, both in terms of grazing, pasture, and the animals themselves, things like this. But let's move on to perhaps one of the bigger ones and of controversial ones. John, what role, if any, is there for gene editing and genetic modification in helping to solve these problems? Maybe we can, produce a crop. So I know someone's working on wheat that doesn't need artificial nitrogen, for instance. That would be a biggie.
Well, I think there's a great deal of future in gene editing, as a matter of fact. I think that there is no doubt that we can now do some things which are really worthwhile. But we have to be very careful about what we do, and we have to do a number of things to protect the basic product in the first place. I mean, I think the retention of the original seeds, the kind of way in which people are now really recognizing that to lose historic forms of plants is an extremely dangerous thing to do. Gene editing seems to me to be much less controversial than genetic modification, because it involves doing things to something that can be done, if you like, naturally. It is one is able to do that. And
just to explain the difference, it doesn't involve bringing in genetic material from another organism. It's within the organism itself. Yep.
And just as we agree in human beings, most of us, that it's perfectly reasonable to alter things that are going to harm a baby, but it's natural. It's to correct the genes rather than anything else. It's the same as far as plants are concerned. But I still think that keeping the originals, making sure that we don't lose our heritage, is crucially important, because in 100 years' time, 50 years' time, even maybe 20 years' time, we'll discover that there is something about some particular historic thing that we ought to be able to use that in a different kind of way. So I just think we have to get that balance right.
Professor Lal, genetics and biotechnology, how big a role in solving these problems?
Oh, yes, scientific technology can play a very big role, definitely. But the problem we have at our hand is so humongous, climate, food, water quality, biodiversity, that technology alone is not good enough. I think this is where everything is on the table. And I'm particularly referring to stewardship concept. I think the very opening statement that John made, that he learned about it, I think we need to involve religious leaders that soil is a most precious resource. It's a God-given gift. We cannot destroy and waste it. So this is where spiritualism, science, technology, economics, legal, all of those things should come together to bear in mind that we, the human, are culprit and victim both. And we have to solve this problem, and we have created it. I think this is the one option that we have. Very briefly, if I may answer another part which has not been discussed in terms of the food and waste and the price of food, is the mega cities. We have 35 mega cities now. Mega city is a city of more than 10 million people. A city of 10 million people requires 6,000 tons of food per day. Very soon, the largest city in the world will have 90 million people. I won't tell you where that city is, but you can make a guess. So the city
I'm
planner,
going Lagos. Am I right?
city, yes, you're right.
Phew.
So city planners must have some food production within the city limit by recycling gray and black water. It is soil-less agriculture, aeroponics, hydroponics, aquaponics, so forth. Very
Catherine, I just
important.
wanted. Sorry, I don't. We need to fit in some audience questions. I do want to do it just before we move on to those, Catherine. I just wanted to see if you kind of went along with the other two in a sort of cautious welcome for some biotech and GE solutions.
I think everything is on the table. And
So sorry, this was excuse me, Professor Lal. This was for Catherine. Excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, my point is basically along those lines. Like everything is on
Mhm.
the table in the sense, but yes, proceed with caution. One of the recent work that I've at least followed and read, there are huge efforts to try and maintain the seed banks for things that where we need to go back and see how were things in prior years. There's a clear evidence in terms of the relationship between health outcomes and the type of wheat that you eat. So they recommend wild varieties as better. So if we get rid of more and more of those things, we might end up with a wheat that just makes all of us sick rather than makes us better. That's what food should be. And so we have to pay attention to things like those, so we don't give up in the name of increasing productivity, that we go with the most
Sure,
productive seed.
but you do raise an issue there, as often these heritage varieties produce a fraction per hectare, and we've established from the very beginning, not least from Professor Lal, that more from less is somewhere we need to go. Just one other to you, Catherine, if I may, and forgive me, I'm going to give you kind of 40 seconds to answer a big question. When it comes to agriculture, particularly in the global south, there's a lot of argument about whether sort of small scale farming, maintaining that method is kind of helping, or is it hindering? So some sort of benign version of if you like, a more commercial, a big ag solution might be part of it. Where do you sit on that argument?
I think it's also a proceed with caution in the sense that food needs are not being met, but they're not being met not because there isn't food available. There are other things in between. There's like infrastructure things. So let's say an example, in southern Tanzania, they produce a lot of fruits and vegetables and a lot of maize. And the missing piece is being able to refrigerate and maintain the viability of the produce. This could help, cities, for example, in Tanzania, and it could sustain the food that's been produced for an extended period. So that is something that could be done that does not necessarily require increasing the size of land under agriculture. The other, obviously, going back to the supply chains and all its issues, is about being able to sustainably and consistently make food available where it's most needed. That is potential there. And of course, obviously produce more within the land that we've already, put towards agriculture is important. So better practices in terms of nutrients, among other things, are really critical, rather than, full scale wiping out other ecosystems in the name of, putting more land towards agriculture. That is absolutely not a solution.
I mean, I mentioned them briefly, but I'm just going to put it in again. Particularly the biodiversity, the nature lobby are so keen that should be a mantra: no more land under the plough or the cow, preferably less. He's an absolute sort of prime directive for them. Right, let's move on to some questions from the audience. I won't necessarily put these to all of you, and if you could be quite punchy in your answers, that would be most appreciated. Betty from Berkhamsted in the UK asks, are there any signs that we are beginning to restore more than we are destroying in terms of our farmland? I suppose in terms of our soils. Professor Lal, restoring more than destroying when it comes to soil?
At present, the answer is no. We are degrading 5 to 10 million hectares per year, and the land degradation neutrality concept, according to Sustainable Development Goal 13, is certainly not on track. But we should.
Okay. And in the UK, John, do you think we're beginning to turn that corner, perhaps restoring less?
I'm not normally known for my support for the government on these things, but I have to say it's biodiversity plans and the fact that it's now put the instruments to make it work means that there will be compulsorily a 10% increase in the biodiversity for any construction or any of that matter. Anything that's destroyed, you have to replace it and have a 10% addition to it. I mean, it's the turnaround, it's the beginning of it, but at least it has happened, and I'm thrilled that it should have happened.
Yeah, this is what they're calling biodiversity net gain, aren't they? That developments have to ensure gain. Right, we'll move on to another one. And I'm going to start with you on this one, Catherine, so listen up. Ben from London asks, how can we overcome global issues such as climate change and food security when, as a species, we tend to adopt a rather fixed, if you like, tribal mindset in the face of adversity?
Well, I think one way to put it is that we're all on the same boat. And if it's leaking, we're all going to go down together, whether we like each other or not. And we have to address these things as a group together. That is much, our differences that, we've identified or have grown up to believe are not important when the raft that we're on is leaking.
But I'm wondering if you got. I mean, this is the $6 million question, if not more. How do we promote that change? Was sort of what he was wondering. I mean, it's one for us in the media as well. I know.
I think one thing is maybe it goes back to education. I think a lot of us don't understand the problems we're trying to address, and so. And we use our differences to justify our choices and options. We care about our most immediate problems rather than the long-term problems that we're dealing with. So it goes back to education, having the general public really clear on what is happening, why it's happening, and what's causing it, and what we can do individually. But we can also push our policymakers to move the needle.
Quick one on tribalism can infect politics, John?
Yeah, but I think the biggest thing is the point that I just add to what's just been said, which I agree with it entirely, is that we've got to use language which people understand. We're constantly, we've used the word biodiversity. Nobody knows what biodiversity is. we use the word net zero, a whole range of things, which when I chairman of the Climate Change Committee, I banned the phrase kilowatt hour, because I don't think anybody knows what a kilowatt hour is. I think you've got to talk about bills, you've got to talk about things that people can really understand. And for me, the biggest battle is to get governments to understand that they have a duty of information. not of correcting people, and
Obfuscation.
a real duty of information, and that they have got to learn to talk the language of people so that they can understand that we're all in the same boat and it's leaking very badly.
One of my language ones that I actually really hate is mitigation. I don't like that at all. I don't think anybody uses it in general conversation, but it's a rash over everything to do with climate. Anyway, let's move on to another question. I'll start with you with this one, Professor Lal. Heather from Worcester in the UK asks, how are microbial populations within soils affected by droughts and then floods? And might that then go on to affect soil fertility?
Yes, microbes in a healthy soil should weigh about total biomass of all organisms, about 5 metric ton per hectare. And any condition which do not meet optimal temperature, moisture, air will adversely affect that activity and eventually soil health and human health. So drought extreme events will certainly have a negative impact on soil biodiversity. So we should try to maintain as optimal condition as possible.
But I think I'm right in saying that a healthy soil, in terms of its structure and its microbial activity, is fairly well known to prevent the worst effects of flooding and of drought. It can recover and operate much better than a beaten up sort of chemical pan soil.
That is a correct statement. Drought and floods are two sides of the same coin, and the coin happen to be soil health. When soil health is bad during the monsoon time, you got floods, and because you had a flood during the dry time, there is no water in soil. You got drought, and drought and floods unfortunately happen at the same place because soils were not treated properly. So managing soil health is the best option to manage the drought and flood syndrome.
Very good. Well, I'm afraid we've got a couple more questions here, but I'm afraid that they're going to have to save them up and maybe put them in the next climate talk. we've run out of time here. But before we go, we have just got some time for some final thoughts from each of you. So, in 1 minute or so, preferably possibly even a little bit less, what change would you like to see in science, policy, technology, or practice to make agriculture more sustainable, which could either, and here's this word, mitigate further climate change, I'll say cut further climate change, reduce further climate change, or adapt to the impacts of climate change? So that was what one change would you like to see in science, policy, technology, or practice to make agriculture more sustainable and reduce the impact of climate change? John Gummer.
Well, I would just like to see governments all over the world providing the information to farmers in the way that they understand of how you do this. There are so many people, I take Britain just the same, who want to do the right thing, but there is no easy way for them to understand precisely what it is. And we really have to recover the old system of ADAS, which used to advise farmers. And we need to tie that very closely to our agricultural universities and to our land based colleges, and really go for a situation in which people learn how to do the things. And then they'll discover what I've discovered, because I've been learning in now farming in an organic way. What I've discovered is that if you do it right, you can produce more rather than less, because the biodiversity means that you have higher yields. You really can do it, but you have to know how. That's all.
Thank you very much, John. Information, education, communication, all very good. Catherine.
I'm going to go along the lines of communication and information. It also falls on scientists to communicate, and not the kilowatts, not the mitigation, but really, really communicate and break down the science. And I think living in the edge that we are in of misinformation, disinformation, people live in very siloed. We're more connected, but we're more siloed. And I think a lot of people receive an event can happen somewhere and people understand it completely different. And this is getting more and more extreme. And if we don't address this, we will not be able to, actively work one as a global community, because there are a lot of, other things that happen in between, and we do not fundamentally understand what's really going on. So we need to address this at the global stage. And I have no idea how that can happen with the different types of social media that exist today. It's like we live in complete parallel worlds. So
Indeed.
that needs to be addressed.
I think I'm sure that's a whole nother Science Museum talk about the atomization of social media. Anyway, Rattan Lal, on this question, what one change would you like to see in science, policy, technology, etc.?
Help from policymakers to translate science into action. That's number one part, which is very critical. Number two is education. And education does not have to be very difficult. Even children's alphabet book could be environment oriented and soil oriented in a native language, which is not the case now. And then policies going back, which are pro-nature, pro-agriculture, and pro-farmer, in which soil and food is respected. I would like somebody to tell people, to a hungry man, God can only appear in a form of a loaf of bread made from grains grown on a healthy soil.
What a perfect way to end. Thank you very much indeed to Professor Lal and Katherine and John Gummer. That is all we have time for right now. So a huge thank you to all our speakers for sharing your insights this evening. I'm sure our audience will agree. It's been inspiring to hear about the work, research, innovation and effort that's going on to tackle the issue of food insecurity and climate. And if anyone was under any illusion about the gravity of the problem at the start of this evening, I think it's safe to say that we've laid out its seriousness, but also that there are solutions out there, the tools in our hands. There are 2 more talks in this series happening next month, including one on February the 15th, when we'll be hearing from a panel discussing India's efforts to reach net zero. I'd like to know more about that. And on the 29th of February, our final talk will examine the issue of the UK's current backlog to connect clean energy projects to the national grid. You can find out more and a free ticket. You can find out more about that and a free ticket via the link below. And if you'd like to support the Science Museum group across all our 5 science museums in the UK, which are free to visit, and support our mission to inspire the next generation of scientists, technicians, engineers, mathematicians, and medics, you can find a link to make a donation in the description below. So it just leaves me to once again thank our speakers, Dr. Katherine Nakalembe, the Right Honourable Lord Deben, and Professor Rattan Lal. And from me, thanks to you all from across the globe for tuning in this evening. Thank you very much and good night.